So my name is Tetyana Lokot. I am an associate professor at Dublin City University. And my book that has just recently been released is called Beyond the Protest Square: Digital Media and Augmented Dissent. What we see happening more and more in countries around the world, including Ukraine, which my book focuses on, is that protest is not entirely physical or material or on the street, but it's also not entirely digital. So it's not only happening on social media, and instead it happens in both of those spaces simultaneously. And so my argument in the book is that we should really try and conceive of the whole thing, the entirety of both the material and digital elements. And Ukraine and the Euromaidan protest was very much a case where we were able to observe it, which is why I focus on it in my book. It sounds strange because you think that technology is sort of something that usually tends to collapse time and collapse space, where, you know, everything is synchronous, everything happens live. But that is actually not quite the case because, you know, people are still separated by distances. So they exist in different cities and different countries. Borders are still a very real thing. And time also exists, right? There is a reason why in this age of Zoom and Skype meetings, we still have trouble setting up meetings between people in different countries because time zones are incredibly real. And I think that very much is also true for people who are, you know, trying to mobilize into a protest movement and are doing so not just in one place or one city, but are doing so you know, throughout the Ukrainian community, for instance, which is, as we know, there are very large Ukrainian diasporas that exist in countries around the world. And we could very much see how time and space affected the way that people were able to join the protest movement in Ukraine. So, for instance, you know, people were of course able to follow events live, but it also meant that very much they had to stay up all night, for instance. You know, they were watching what was happening in Ukraine from the US, from the East Coast or even the West Coast. And people in Ukraine were also quite conscious that, you know, the fact that somebody was transmitting live from the protests in the square also had a huge impact on how those events were perceived. Again, compared to somebody who was reporting, say, a day after the protest happened. I think you could say that citizen journalists are probably the group that were some of the early adopters of digital technology, and they very quickly learned, you know, the value of being on different social media channels, of using the power of sharing images or live streaming video. So they were probably some of the people who caught on to the fact that reality is very much augmented and that it's digital and physical at the same time. If you know, I don't know how much you are aware of the role of live streams in Euromaidan, but they actually played quite a significant role because the people who weren't able to be in the square as the action was happening in the Maidan or across Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, live streams played a huge part. Because most of those live streams were, in fact, by citizen journalists, by people who were not professional journalists, but they provided really, you know, a real-time window into the events that were unfolding, and they were actually able to circumvent some of the censorship that was happening in more mainstream media or, you know, media that were influenced by the state that didn't report on the protest at first. It's not enough to just say, well, here's what digital media do for activists or for protests, but that they, depending on the context of, you know, what is happening in the country, the regime, the freedom of the media, they can do very different things, and sometimes they're limited in what they can do. So, for instance, in Ukraine, what we saw during Euromaidan was there was obviously some control that the state had over mainstream media, but they really had very little control or understanding of social media, you know, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of those live streaming platforms. So the Ukrainian state under Yanukovych at that point didn't really see people using the internet or social media as a threat, which is why I think people were able to use social media in such creative ways. And they were able to come up with really ingenious ways of using them to organize protest activity, to, you know, to live stream and make things more visible. then to also use those live streams and recordings that exist now to conduct investigations right into all of the police brutality and all the killings that took place. And so we had a lot of creative freedom. And again, diasporas, as you say, were also really heavily involved in using social media in very creative ways to fundraise, to build support outside of Ukraine. In Russia, I think the situation is very different, and it's become increasingly more obvious how different it is. Going back to the 2012 Bolotnaya protests and to the more recent protests in 2017, 2019, 2020, social media is becoming increasingly suppressed by the state. The state has realized quite early on that digital media and the internet is also a threat to the dominance of the Russian state. So they really, and I think Euromaidan was actually one of the reasons why they became even more aware of the threat of the internet. So they have tried to really pass a lot of draconian legislation to introduce more and more ways of censoring internet, of cracking down on free speech, of promoting more and more ways to survey the population, to control what they say, where they go, to the point where we now have people who are going to prison with substantial sentences for retweeting a call to a protest rally. So, the situation is incredibly different. So I think Russian activists really see social media as almost a lifeline. So they're not just using it creatively, but for them, it's a means of survival, really. This is their one free channel where they can still express and mobilize and make visible what the state is doing to them. I think, we really should think about technologies as not necessarily only tools, because they also create specific environments for people to communicate, to engage with each other, but it's really all about how people use those tools, and how their ability to do something or not do something is constrained or enabled. So in my book, I use a term called affordances, which is a term that comes from psychology, and that basically argues that any technology has different potential uses depending on who is using it and in what context. So, to give you a very crude example, when people press the Facebook like button, they may be pressing it in order to like something, or they may be pressing it as a means of expressing solidarity or of expressing sympathy, right? Those are all slightly different things. But you really can't press a like button if you want to dislike something, right? That's very difficult. And that's why Facebook has finally introduced also dislike buttons. So any kind of technological innovation or technological tool or platform, it has its opportunities, but it also comes with limitations. And so, of course, if we go back to the protest and how technologies were used in the protest, right, so a very specific example I can give you, for instance, is marking your location. Every smartphone comes with a ability to geolocate yourself. So a person could post a tweet or share a Facebook post and mark themselves being in a specific place, for instance, in Maidan Nezalezhnosti, in Independence Square in Ukraine. And it's great because it shows that there is strength in numbers, that you're there with a bunch of other people. So it's a great opportunity to show solidarity, to show that there's a mobilized protest community. But if you are doing this in a state which surveils social media and that persecutes users for coming out to protest, then you're basically putting a mark on your back, right? If your name is tied to a specific location. So in a way, it's the regime and the context of surveillance in a highly policed state that limits your ability to do that, right? Whereas in a more free state, you can do that because you face no consequences. The government probably saw this as a highly high-tech tactic of, basically scaring the people, saying we're watching you. But I think for one, people were already fairly conscious of the fact that, well, they were being watched because there'd been some physical attacks on protesters and, there were some attempts to kidnap some of the activists. But I think the ironic thing was that that blast of text messages was so really poorly, I think, kind of focused that even people who lived, for instance, in apartment buildings on the edge of the square or 2 streets down also got that message. And so the people who were sitting at home drinking tea went, well, I got this message, so I might as well go out and join the protest, right? So it almost did really have the opposite effect because, so I think, the realization that it's important to be in people's smartphones and to send them messages there because that's what they're looking at is there. But I think the technical capability or, any genuine ability to manipulate the social media space wasn't there. And I think that's where the activists really had the edge. I think for me, the research process really started, it started on social media, ironic as it may sound. So I think in one of my chapters, I tell the story of how we first learned that there was something going on in Kiev. I was doing my postgraduate work in the University of Maryland at the time. And so in November 2013, I happened to be in New York. I was giving a guest lecture in the Rowman Institute in Columbia, where a friend of mine was teaching. And we were, of course, talking about the media and the internet in Ukraine. So she posted a photo of me delivering a lecture to her students on Facebook. And another friend who we both shared said, we're having a revolution here, stop teaching and start watching. And we said, we're already watching, right? So I think, as for many other Ukrainians who were based abroad, for us, it all started with those first messages and images and videos that we saw on social media. And so when I was thinking about constructing my research process, I immediately, of course, really wanted to go to on the ground. I went to Kiev. I went to the protest. It's really hard to describe the feeling in you when you emerge in the central square, place that where you've been thousands of times, and it's completely transformed. You have tents, you have fires going on, you have people delivering speeches, lectures. There's so many things going on, and it was a really fascinating and I think important component of my research process, going in on the ground, speaking to people in various settings, in cafes, in the tents, elsewhere in their offices, because I think when people think about studying social media, they really just think that everything takes place online. But for me, it was really important to see how people were using these technologies in the everyday protests routine, right? So what they were doing with them. Because, some of those questions really you don't think about, but like if they're in the square all the time, where do they charge their phones, right? Who provides the internet? And all of those things were hugely important for the protest because we saw local internet providers providing quality internet, restaurants around the square opening their Wi-Fi for free to people, IT specialists coming together to create like an IT tent where they offered people free electricity charging and, fixing their devices. So all of those things really were important and were part of this augmented reality of protest. So I did interviews. Of course, I also did some collection of information in big social media groups, the key social media groups around the protests. So there were a few really large Facebook groups and some smaller ones. And it was interesting to see how there were these big communities that were about everything related to the protests, but there were also smaller groups specializing in particular things. So you had the medics, you had people who were in charge of resources like firewood and gas. You had people who were in charge of educational activities, right? So you had the Free Maidan University. You also had people who were behind the scenes coordinating all of these different resources and needs. So it was a fascinating network of different groups and different collectives of people, all mostly working volunteer, doing as many hours as they could. And social media were also instrumental in coordinating all of these activities because, if you have thousands of people doing something, inevitably you will get bottlenecks, you will get 3 groups doing the same thing. So somebody had to kind of be there and start to make sense of all of this. And we haven't even mentioned the diasporas, which I know we will. But so, was a lot of work. Obviously, Ukraine is no stranger to civic organizing. We had groups that have been around since, the fall of the Soviet Union and probably before, who were sort of active and were developing these tactics and coordinating. We had the Orange Revolution, we had movements before that. So there were some people who had some you could say, experience in coordinating protest rallies and mobilizing people. But I think the scale of Euromaidan was so vast, where at certain points you had hundreds of thousands of people all coming together. And that's just the people who were physically there. But you also had those vast networks of people in other places in Ukraine and other cities which had their own local Euromaidans. And then you obviously had everybody joining from abroad, from the US, from Canada, from a range of European countries. Right. So coordinating that is a much more difficult task. Because it's much harder to see what resources are available to you. So I think even the experienced civic organizers really had to learn, I think, to be less skeptical perhaps of social media and, the power that those networked connections could offer to them. One thing that I was surprised by when I was asking people about, what they didn't expect to get from social media, and they did. I think one of the things they mentioned was that it actually turned out to be a really useful set of tools for vetting people who you could trust. Because I think a lot of those networks across borders and in Ukraine were built on relationships of trust, right? Fundraising, finding an expert who would be able to do something really specific for you. Even if you don't know somebody personally, it's always, for instance, quite handy, it turns out, to go on LinkedIn and to see what mutual connections you have with them. And then to ask those people, is this a good person? Can we trust them? Right? So it turned out that very human things that you would usually be able to maybe do by going to the bar with someone and having a drink and getting to know them, that social media helps really fill that need a little bit because of how those networks were connected. So I think I heard this a lot from people in the diaspora, especially who were really engaged with fundraising and engaged with lobbying efforts and, on an international level. So finding those really trustworthy connections turned out to be really easy, or at least easier if you had those social media connections to rely on. And in terms of local activists in Ukraine, I think for them, something that, they did the live streams and there were lots of videos that people were capturing, and they didn't really think about the value those records would have until after the protest, when all of these investigations and prosecutions and attempts to identify how the bloodiest days of the Euromaidan unfolded. I think that value of those records, both for doing the investigations, but also for creating a set of memories that were shared by the protesters, turned out to be really important. And they really only realized this after the protest was over. I think the Ukrainian diaspora is quite an interesting phenomenon in itself, because I think, for one, we would have to say that there are several different waves of Ukrainian diaspora, and certainly in the US and Canada that is true. So you have the diaspora who has been there for quite some time, several generations of people who have a really interesting relationship with Ukraine, in that they almost have this imaginary of a country that wasn't there when they left, but that they still believe that Ukraine can be something bigger and better, and they're sometimes much more involved and much more interested in contributing to progress in Ukraine than even people within Ukraine. So I found that to be quite fascinating, and I don't think the Russian diaspora necessarily has the same relationship with with what is now Russia. On the other hand, there's also a newer wave of Ukrainian diaspora, so people who went to do graduate studies or went to work. And I have to say, most of my interviewees in the US were these Ukrainians who were there for comparatively less time. But many of them had this distinct notion that they were in the West or in the US for some amount of time, and maybe they left because they didn't see a future in Ukraine. But Euromaidan to them meant that potentially they were now seeing a promise of something that they could actually return to. And I think for many of them, that was really what framed their engagement with the protest, because they were so passionate about advocating on behalf of Euromaidan, of going to protest rallies in their own cities where they lived, and just generally taking such a keen interest and trying to figure out ways of supporting the protest as much as they could. So to me, I think that was a key difference. I mean, I didn't really interview hackers per se as part of my Euromaidan interviews, and I think the hackers as actors became, I think, more prominent after the protest, right? When we went into the conflict stage, which obviously happened quite quickly after the protest. And I think, there is obviously a perception that on the whole, at least, of the actors that we do see in like the digital space, that the hackers who operate and who defend, I guess, the honor of Ukraine tend to do so for, at least, if we listen to their own words, they tend to do this on quite a kind of a patriotic basis, because they love their country and they want to defend Ukraine from external enemies, mostly Russia. Whereas the Russian hackers, I think, the way they've been sort of portrayed and the way we mostly experience them are almost like employees of the state. So they don't necessarily have their own sort of position or their own kind of foundation that they act upon, but rather they just do whatever the state wants them to do. I mean, I think that's probably not a very nuanced response, because obviously there are tons of different actors operating in this space. There are also tons of different actors who engage in misinformation, whether running troll armies or bot armies, and I think it's an increasingly crowded space. But it is, I think, interesting that in general, the Ukrainian hackers that I've sort of watched and that I've looked at their work, that they also have these really clear, like, manifestos almost, that they publish when they talk about things they hacked or things they leaked, whereas the Russian hackers or like the Russian state-sponsored hackers don't really tend to do that. They just do it, and they don't really explain why they're doing it. I think my favorite chapter in the book is the chapter that talks about one of the key sort of affordances that emerged from the interviews with protesters, both in Ukraine and abroad, and that's the chapter on visibility and witnessing. So the chapter talks about, the role of social media in how they enable visibility for protesters, and the importance not only for the protest itself, as an event that is created in order to be seen. So, of course, having visibility is really crucial. But it also changes how protesters themselves and then other more removed audiences, how they become witnesses to this historic event. If you think back in history, really the only records we have from a lot of really important historical events are something that somebody wrote down, so we don't really know how trustworthy that particular person is as a historian of record, and we have to go by their word. If we're lucky, we may have several different records by different people of the same event, but right now we're in a situation where things are being witnessed simultaneously as they're happening by multiple people. And so on the one hand, it might seem like, well, if everybody is live streaming or if everybody is posting about it on Twitter, it's just going to be the same stuff posted over and over. So what's the difference? But it turns out that, the Euromaidan protest, as an example, was so big and so vast that we ended up with multiple histories, right? And somebody in Kiev who who was in the protest camp every day, participated in all of the activities, defended the barricades, may have had one experience. Somebody who was in another city in Ukraine and who maybe came to visit, but then went back and created a mini Maidan in their own city, had a different experience. Somebody who was also in Kiev, but had a day job that they couldn't leave and only could go down to the protest maybe once or twice a week, but nonetheless contributed by building something, some kind of website or some kind of network, had a different story. And then obviously somebody in New York or in Washington, D.C., who spent their nights translating Ukrainian protest updates into English had an entirely different story. And I think the great thing about it is that we have now this collection of different narratives, of different memories, which together make up the protest and make up Euromaidan. And I think, the important work that happened after the protest, part of it was coming to terms with all of these different histories, but also realizing that they all have the right to be part of the big story. And it's a multiple voices, democratic in the sense of having multiple stories about the protest. And I think the social media play a huge part in that because they allow for that multiplicity of voices. I think that's what's a core group of activists behind Euromaidan and its communications very quickly realized. They realized that we can fight for visibility and we can fight for some kind of frontline page space, but we need to make information available in multiple languages as fast as we can. So in very quickly, I think, like in the first month, we had projects emerge in Euromaidan which were specifically focused on creating these digests of information about what was happening in the protest and in the country, and translating them, and not just into English, but also into French, into Spanish, into the main sort of most popular languages, and making them available. And those continued throughout the protests. And obviously, you had a time in the beginning where it was just local journalists. Then Russian journalists started trying to come in, weren't really welcome. Then you had the foreign press that descended on Kiev. But many of the foreign journalists, I mean, there was a good group of core journalists who stuck with Euromaidan and were there throughout the events. But the majority of them parachuted in, took some photos of burning tires, talked to a couple of people, went back. But those updates and those translations, and also all of the crowdsourced translations, of just key events, key nights where the confrontation was happening, there were just multiple people sitting in front of their computers just translating live tweets and live posts, which I think was hugely important. And to me, I think that was one of the really key things that made Euromaidan different and made it stand out. Like, it was truly a transnational event. In more ways than one, because of the diaspora participation, but also because of that material that's been made available in so many languages. And I mean, some of the media outlets that were created, like Euromaidan Press, is a website that still exists and still continues to do journalist work, not necessarily only about Euromaidan. But so I think, it was a really interesting moment where we saw, that yes, media are important and channels are important, but it also putting the right people in the right place at the right time to do the right kind of work is also incredibly important. It's really important to understand an event. You really have to go to the place where it's happening, whether that's on social media or in Kiev or elsewhere, and you have to talk to the people. You can't just assume that what you're seeing on social media is the thing that's happening, because it's only part of the story, right? The other story is unfolding in tents, in little cafes around the corner, in offices around Kiev, where people are spending their night building software and building websites and maps and all that stuff, right? So it's really important to understand all of the places and spaces where that event is happening. I'd say there are sort of two main conclusions or things that I would like people to take away from the book. The first one is really that we are living in a hybrid reality that doesn't just apply to protest, but that our world and our everyday existence increasingly consists of both material and digital layers that are really closely stuck together. It's impossible to unstick them, right? And so I think any event today, be it a protest or a conflict or anything that is happening across the world, should be understood as composed of that digital and material layer. And we should understand how they influence what's happening. And my second takeaway would be that, again, based on the research that I did in Ukraine and later in Russia, it's impossible to understand the role of any kind of communicative technology in activism or protest without understanding the context in which it's being used. Increasingly, we see that, in Ukraine, they're championing digital transformation. The state is now paying much more attention to the digital sphere. And even though there have been a few attempts to impose some controls, it still remains largely free. So that creates a specific context for how people can use social media. Whereas in Russia, we're seeing, again, increasing crackdowns on the internet as a space for free expression, surveillance, things like facial recognition, impossible to be anonymous. Everywhere you go, people are trying to track what you do, what you say. So again, that creates a very different context for anybody who is seeking to use digital media to mobilize people or to organize any kind of opposition movement, for instance. So I think contextualizing the use of digital technologies in political and social realities of the place where they're being used would be another really important takeaway, and one that I hope is not just for academics, but also for governments, for states, for diplomats, for policymakers, and for advocates and civil society actors. I think that is a finding that I would really want people to take away. Just because you're a programmer who knows how to code something or to write something doesn't mean you have necessarily reckoned with the consequences of what the technology you have built will do, right? So I think, again, this is probably also a call to the technologists and to the techies, to the developers, to really think hard about the potential implications that your technology might have if it falls into the wrong hands, or if it ends up being used by a regime that seeks to control and to persecute its own people. I think the refrain of responsible technology and accountable accountable development is one that is becoming increasingly urgent. As we see events unfolding anywhere from Belarus, where foreign technology has been used to shut down mobile networks and surveil people, to Myanmar, where now again we have another conflict that is emerging. This is a global issue, and I think it's not going to go away anytime soon. So this critical engagement with the potential power of technology is going to remain really important. I think I would just really like to draw attention to the fact that this book tells one story, or one and a half. It tells the story of what happened in Ukraine and what might be happening in Russia, but there are opportunities to apply the ideas in this book to many other scenarios, again, to what's happening in Belarus, to what may or may not end up happening in a lot of other countries around the world. So I think what I would like for the book to do is also to inspire other researchers to apply these ideas to other contexts. Obviously, my book also builds on the ideas of many other people who have done work on Turkey, who have done work on the Arab Spring. But I hope that it will also draw attention to the region, because I think our region, the Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Moldova, there's lots and lots of stuff there that remains understudied. And I think it does warrant greater attention, because there's a lot of really interesting things happening in the region. So I hope this also inspires, other graduate students, early career scholars to do their research in the region as well. That's my ultimate goal. So I'm really interested in building on some of the ideas in the book, but taking a wider lens and really thinking about the role of technology in our lives, and not necessarily just in the region, but also the region offers such a rich ground for examination. I'm really interested in how people think about digital freedom more generally, internet freedom, what it means to people in different countries, how do states conceptualize what it means, and what does it mean to be a digital citizen. So right now my thinking is going in this direction, and hopefully at some point there will be another book, but maybe not just yet. Great. Well, thank you. This was a really great conversation.